Our first presentation this morning will be from our fiscal department. We have our fiscal officer here that will share information in regard to new policies, and he was telling me that he knows everyone's really excited about the new changes that are down the pipe. So at this time, I'd like to share with you and present Caleb and Sandra.
Thank you, Rosaria. Hi, everyone. My name is Caleb Yant. I'm the Chief Financial Officer at OHCS. I know a few of you, and I don't know most of you. And I'm here with Sandra Flickinger, who is our Finance and Procurement Manager. So as Rosaria said, we're going to talk through fiscal policies that are new and going to be going into effect starting next biennium. Yeah, I'm sure that this is probably the part of the two-day agenda that everybody has been looking forward to more than anything else. So I'm happy to be here to be able to be the keynote here. So I want to give a little bit of background and context here. I think before I start, we have, I don't know, something like 15 pages, 15 slides, maybe a little bit less. There are some documents in your packets. That is a memo that went to the CAPO board on the final time that I went in front of them to have the discussion about fiscal policies. There's the fiscal policies itself, and there's a description of changes to kind of business process. We'll talk through that through the presentation, so feel free to look at that, or we'll try to cover that. I want to be cognizant of the fact that this we're presenting information, and so to the extent that if you have questions, don't wait till the end. Raise your hand, interrupt us. We're going to be talking at you, and that's not my favorite thing to do. So to the extent that we can make this interactive, that is usually a better way to get through information. The other thing I want to say before I get into the kind of the content of it is I think most of the participants here today are kind of from the homeless services side of the different community action agencies. And so just to be clear, I'm going to go kind of do a flyby of really what the big impacts of this policy will be, I think specifically for the program staff. So there's three main pieces to this policy. The first is that we're moving to annual allocations for all OHCS grants. And to be really clear about that, we think, and talking to the CAPO board, this should be administratively a lot easier for pretty much everybody in the room. Right now, our energy assistance dollars, some come monthly, some come annually. For EHA, we get the document recording fee quarterly, and so we provide allocations of that quarterly to you all. The general fund is obviously on a biennium, so it's a 2-year basis. And so we're often and somewhat constantly providing allocations of funds for you to spend, for you to plan for and spend. This policy is saying, based on either the state fiscal year or federal fiscal year, we will provide all of the funds up front at the beginning of the fiscal year. And so that way you'll have the single allocation, and you'll be able to budget and plan for, this is how much EHA will have for the entire year. This is how much all of my homeless services funds, all of my weatherization funds, all of my energy assistance funds. So that's the first of the big changes. The second, I love when I see people whispering. I want to hand them, like, no, it's good. I'm just so curious as to what is being said.
All positive.
I'm sure. Whenever the CFO talks, it's always all positive. The second is that you all do your work plans for your different grants from OHCS, and I imagine some of them are being worked on right now. It's for the new MGA. For the first time, you're going to include when the money is going to be spent in those work plans. So we're moving to annual allocations, but you're going to say, at quarter one, I expect to have this percentage of my EHA spent, quarter two, quarter three, and that sort of thing. So as you're doing your work plans, you're going to be saying, this is when I plan to spend the money, not just how, as far as the different services. And so that will be applicable, again, for all OHCS grants. And then the third main thing that this policy does is it really is trying to provide for better external financial reporting. So for the last couple years, OHCS has been putting financial reporting about document recording fee, EHA, some of the public purpose charge dollars on our website. I will admit that it is ugly financial reporting, but people that care are looking at it. And one of the things that I've heard consistently from the CAPO board specifically, as we've been putting this financial reporting up there, is that it's not telling the whole story. It is expenditure information from OHCS. And so there's all the work in progress that you all have, whether it's EHA that's tied to a client for rent assistance, but you haven't drawn the money for it from OHCS yet, or a weatherization project where the Community Action Agency has spent the funds, but you haven't drawn the money from OHCS yet. And so for us to say, this is where we're at in spending the money down from just a cash perspective, that's not capturing that information. So the other thing that this policy does is it creates a uniform process to capture that committed money, and it defines what that is, and it's the same for homeless services and energy services. And so that way, when we are doing our external financial reporting, that will be in all of that reporting. So we'll be able to include that to kind of tell the story of, yeah, this is where we're at from a cash perspective, but this is where these are the clients we're serving, so it's more of that kind of full picture. So we'll get into all of that in a little bit, but I just wanted to give a quick flyby of that's kind of what we're talking about here. Okay, so I'm gonna give a little bit of the background, the issues being addressed, the why, and then I'm gonna hand it over to Sandra, who's gonna talk through, kind of get into a little bit of the meat of the fiscal policies, about what they are and about how we plan to implement them. Any questions so far? Okay. So background, timeline of the why. So who here has heard really anything about fiscal policies other than they're coming? A few people. Okay, that's kind of what I expected. So I want to provide a little bit of context. This conversation really started in earnest back in October of 2017 at a fiscal training. And it started framed around a couple issues. One, it really was from conversations that we had when their community action agencies identified that they were having a hard time spending their allocations of funds. There was no consistent process for how money was moved from one community action agency to another, if that had to happen. And concerns were often flagged very late in the biennium. So it was, I think I'm going to spend my money, I think I'm going to spend my money. Oh shoot, there's 3 months left in a 24-month biennium, I don't think I'm going to be able to spend it. And it was all hands on deck, sort of like, we don't want the federal money to go back to the feds or the general fund money to be reverted back to the state general fund. What do we got to do to get this spent? So a big kind of impetus for this conversation was a desire from both OHCS and from CAPO to have a proactive process to be able to, if that's going to happen, let's identify it early, and let's work together to see if we could change our work plans or whatever the case may be to get the money spent in the community that it was intended for, and if not, have more of a uniform process on how we do this. So it was reactive, it often relied on self-identified issues, and the process was really different between the different grants that we had. Energy did it somewhat different than homeless services and that sort of thing. So we started the conversation, kind of all agreeing on those issues. And then at the first of really 3 main engagements that I had with the CAPO board, going over iterations of this policy, we started with the question of, do we care that the money stays in the community that it was intended for? right? We know that it's a needs-based formula, it goes out, most of our grants go out in that way. Let's just make sure we all care that it does stay in that community. And there was uniform, yes, we care about that. And at the same time, we don't want to lose federal money. So there was an additional policy that kind of we drafted, and we went to the CAPO board. I had 3 different meetings over the course of a series of months with the CAPO board. I will say the policy that is in your packets is significantly modified from where it started, from feedback from those different board meetings. And then ultimately it was October, I think, is the memo in your packet where I went to the CAPO board, and we kind of agreed that this is the policy that we can move forward with. And we went in December to Housing Stability Council, myself and Janet Merrill presented the policy to our Housing Stability Council. And since then, we've been working on system enhancements, which we'll get into here in a little bit, and are almost done in order to support this new policy. So really quickly getting into the why, I kind of covered this already, but I'll hit on a few other points. The first is key mutual desire for proactive fund management to recognize and react to recognize early rather than be reactive if there are issues. The second one is just really in recognition that the state legislature has made unprecedented investments, right? We're really excited that the governor's budget has EHA and SHAP at $40 million as part of the current service level. Not one-time funding, but current service level. It's a game changer. And with those additional investments is a lot more questions from legislative fiscal, from legislators, from the appropriators who are providing that money. And so there's a need for that, the reporting on how the money is spent, where the money is spent. I want to recognize that in many ways this policy is majoring in the minors. We're talking about making sure the money stays in the community it's intended for, not the best outcomes for the money. So I'm the nerdy fiscal guy that's talking about that, and that the bigger question is what outcomes do we get from our investments? But there's a need for that scrutiny. There's a need to tell the story, like I said earlier, as far as the whole picture of the funding, not just dollars out the door. And then the other piece is a recognition that for years, OHCS has allowed funds, if it's not general fund or if the federal fund's allowed, to be rolled forward from one biennium to the next. And so if the money wasn't spent, it was rolled forward. And that has drawn a lot of scrutiny from the legislature. You all probably are mostly homeless services, so you probably don't, you may not know about this, but a few years back there was an attempt to sweep some of the energy, the weatherization dollars from our accounts to the general fund. The governor vetoed it, so that didn't happen. But that's the sort of scrutiny that we want to make sure to drive down these balances, so we can show that we're putting the money to use, and we're not subject to these kind of legislative sweeps or those sorts of things. So that's kind of the background on why we started to have this conversation, why we're moving to these policies. Any questions so far? I'm talking a lot. Yeah.
Is the legislature going to actually approve this?
So this is an OHCS policy.
No, I understand that, but I mean the additional money that the governor has asked of the legislature.
I wish I could answer that question.
Yeah, I know. I mean, how does it look, I guess, at this point, or is that?
So I will say that there was, every biennium there's what's called a budget reconciliation bill, which it talks about what they're changing from last biennium's budget. And in the budget reconciliation bill, there are words that talk about the increased EHA and SHAP moving to part of the current service level. So that's a very positive thing. They as they're amending what they did last biennium, they're talking about keeping it at current service level. So that's the biggest sign that we've seen that this is there's legs behind this. But it's hard to predict. Last biennium, the increased EHA and CHAP, we got $10 million more in EHA and CHAP during our budget hearing, and then in what is called the Christmas tree bill that happens the last couple of days of legislative session. That's where the additional $20 million came, for a total of $30 million more. That's what happens often, is, in the last days of legislative session, all of the final sausage is made, and it just happens.
Okay.
So.
I'm just new to this whole thing, so.
Absolutely, no, it's great questions, and,
Yeah.
I am spending a lot of time answering a lot of questions about the investments in the governor's budget, and so we're optimistic, but, we never know until the bills are signed. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, so background, issues being addressed. I kind of covered this, when community action agencies weren't able to spend their allocations, kind of one of two things happened. Again, the money was rolled forward if we could. And so just to be clear, this policy, there's details in your packet. It basically says we'll allow up to 10% of funds to be rolled forward, because we know we're not going to sign MGAs in all cases on July 1st. There needs to be, some money that can ensure continuity of service, but the ability to roll forward large chunks of money isn't going to happen starting in the next biennium. So that was one of the two things that happened, and the other is money was transferred between community action agencies. And again, there was a lack of consistency in that process, and quite frankly, a lack of transparency as well. It was kind of a last minute sort of, what do we got to do to get the money spent? And that's part of what we don't want to happen. This slide just really kind of talks about, this is just a kind of an arbitrary 2-year period, but this is money that left the community that it was intended for. And specifically related to kind of inability to spend issues. So there's the caveats there at the bottom are dollars that we excluded from this. But this shows somewhat of a kind of a degree of magnitude of what we're talking about here, right? For energy services, it was $677,000 over a 2-year period, and for homeless services, it was $241,000. This isn't talking about the roll forwards. This is just money that left the kind of the community that it was intended for. Last biennium, just as a kind of a point of context here, the money that was rolled forward for EHA specifically was about $906,000 rolled forward from last biennium to this biennium. And so that just is a little bit of context as to where we have been and what we're trying to do here. So I think this is the last slide before I hand it over to Sandra.
So what you're saying is, as far as our agencies are concerned, allowing a 10% rollover is an acceptable amount?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. On a go forward. And just to be really clear, and Sandra will get into this, we're starting this now. We're going to let you roll forward for this biennium, whatever we normally would have. Knowing that we're going to have this transition period. And so when you're working on your work plans and saying, this is how I plan to spend my money, to the extent that you can roll money forward, whatever grant it is, you'll be able to do that and add that to your current annual allocation and say, great, my annual allocation is $100,000, I rolled forward 25, and so this is how I plan to spend $125,000 over the next year. Yeah, Connor.
Thank you, Caleb. So I'm trying to understand this, for the most part, makes sense. The one area where I'm trying to think about how this works is with CSBG funding. Since that tends to be things that are more big picture plans, and so it's often a funding source where plans versus reality don't line up quite as well. So obviously that's not one we roll over Oregon fiscal year to fiscal year, but will this impact the ability to do a 3-month extension at the end of the calendar year? And then also, will you be holding into the same requirements that you must have spent a certain amount within that spending plan?
Yeah, great questions. So there are some nuance in the law, and CSBG is one of them. Lie heap, I see David Kaufman looking at me, hoping that I don't say something wrong here in the back. I also hope I'm not saying anything wrong here. Where, you know, there's a holdback of a certain percent, and you could roll forward, there's kind of some nuance there. And I know I don't have my notes on specifically on CSBG, but I know we talked about exactly, you know, kind of what that will be, and there's some detail that we can share out. So federal funds will be on federal fiscal year, state funds will be on state fiscal year. So, and yes, CSBG will be held to the same, you gotta spend it down within the period that it was intended for. I will say one of the things that we'll kind of get to is you make your plans, the system will be automated, will notify us if us being OHCS and whoever wants to get the automated notification that, hey, we're below our plans. And then that will be a trigger to say, we need to modify our work plans and see, you know, maybe our plans have changed. And so there's that first step to say, all right, we're below it, let's work together, let's figure out what it should be, let's resubmit a new work plan, time-bound expenditure plan in association with what we know now. And so there's a kind of a series of steps that will happen there. But generally, yeah, it will be all of our funds will be under this one policy.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So how does that work specifically with the home TDA grant? As it is now, when we add clients before the end of the biennium, they have funds like committed to them, and those would those be counted as rollover? Because usually those funds stay with that client because they're committed in one biennium or in one fiscal year, and then they stay with that client in the next until because they're committed to that. So
Absolutely.
Does
Yeah.
that work? Would that change?
So, I mean, that's a really good question. I think the intent behind this is that we're using the home TDA funds in this case in the expenditure, the period that they were intended for. So trying to spend that down and not say, you know, if we have, and I apologize, I don't know how many months home TDA can be used for rental assistance, but if it was 6 months, that we're not ending the period with 1 month into a 6-month period, and therefore we're retaining a large balance that we're rolling forward, but instead to try to use that money in the period that it was intended for, and then, and then use next year's appropriation in that period that it was intended for. I will say that there's elements of this that are going to be a work in process, so we're going to have to look to see, you know, is that under the 10% threshold? You know, so that the idea of that is to be able to roll some of that money forward. If it's a substantial chunk of money, we'll need to look to see, you know, is there a way to get that spent on clients today, you know, or in this period, and rather than reserving a large chunk of it and just rolling it forward. So I know that's an imperfect answer.
So the committed funds are considered rollover funds?
The committed funds are considered rollover funds, absolutely.
That'll be a problem.
That'll be a big problem.
Caleb,
Yeah.
that is way different than the way that funding is managed now. So maybe at our meeting on the 22nd, we can delve into TDA.
Sure.
And then we'll let everybody know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, so I'm with Black in this county, and we're kind of a little bit of a hybrid community action because we do a lot of services ourselves, but we also contract with a lot of providers out in the community. And so I guess where I could see us being pretty challenged with this is that we'll find out what our amounts are, you know, within, like, it could be anytime up to like June 30th. Like, so let's say June 15th, the state passes their budget. Let's just say that. So then then we finally know our amounts. So then under the state procurement rules, we have to go through a competitive procurement process for our outside providers, and then that takes time. And then sometimes people propose projects, and for whatever reason, you know, they have the same thing that we have, where they wanted to try something and then for whatever reason it didn't work or whatever. But I'm just interested in your thoughts on kind of how does this process kind of overlap with like the whole state procurement, and like in reality, how do you suggest that we work that like in our work plans? Because a lot of times we struggle in our work plans because we may not even know who all of our providers are at the time when we're doing the work plan.
Absolutely. And I think everybody struggles with that. We struggle with that as well, right? And June 15th, we could be so lucky that we know how much money that we have on June 15th. In all reality, it will be June 30th.
29.
June 29th, yeah. I think I said this before, but there is a standard work plan that's kind of applicable for all grants, and then for each grant, as part of your, a standard spend plan, and then you'll do one specifically to how you plan to spend the money. And so the standard one tries to predict some of that, right? When you're a quarter of the way through, we're not expecting a quarter of the money to be spent, because we know it takes a while to ramp up for all of the reasons that you talked about, and I'm sure a lot more. So the idea is, you're not going to hit the ground, I'm an accountant, right? So straight line sort of a spending of the money. One day into a 365-day year, you're going to be exactly 1/365th through your money. So there's this idea of a kind of a ramp up as you go through the expenditure. That's the standard. The other thing though is you'll create the work plan to say, this is what we plan to do, and this is how I plan to spend the money. It might be different than that. You might be at 8% a quarter of the way through, and 30% at half the way through, or something along those lines. The idea here is, if you're under both the standard and the one that you say, this is how I plan to spend the money, that's where the system will kind of generate an email to trigger to say, hey, we're below what we plan to do, let's talk. So the idea is that, that it should reflect that need to be able to ramp up. Does that speak to your question? Kind of?
To an extent. Okay.
Do you want to follow up?
No. But thank you.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but I think that will become much more clear, that process, when we do the MCA review of the work plan this afternoon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Other questions? So I think it was on policy tenets. So here's, again, just the general things we're trying to accomplish here. Consistent business process for all of our funds. I appreciate the conversation, the question on TDA, right? There is some nuance, and I had this conversation with capable board members. It's different at a kind of that executive director level than it is with the people who are administering the programs, whether that be management or program coordinator or whatever the case may be. That's part of the reason why Sandra and I are coming here. We're going to a weatherization meeting in like a week to kind of talk through this, and get this sort of feedback. So we'll certainly follow up on home PDA. But one of the things we're trying to do is be consistent across all of our grants. We have different terms right now between homeless services and energy services. We have different processes between the two. And so a need for consistent business processes so that, the two big ones, and there are more than this, but it's the standard spin down rates with the work, the CAA generated spin down rates for everything, and then there's the annual allocations for everything. Another piece is engagement and collaboration between OHCS, community action agencies, and applicable community partners, right? We'll go through this process. If we're not meeting targets, the very first thing is for us to get together to say, what can we do? Is there learning that we can have from other community action agencies, from our staff, training technical assistants? We have integrators that would that be helpful for them to come out? I want to flag that this is one of the things that I heard loudest from the capable board members, which I very much appreciate, is there's no one-size-fits-all community. And so the technical assistance side of things cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach. And so that's one of the changes here. Is there's not going to be a formulaic, this is how we will engage. But the intent behind that is if plans aren't being met, let's get together, let's rework it. And how can we help to create a new plan where we're able to get the money spent and ultimately the money stays in the community that it was intended for. Prior practices of rolling forward substantial unused balances will be eliminated, and then the financial reporting modified to include committed funds to better tell the story. That's that piece of the kind of the work in progress, or the money reserved for clients for rent assistance, or things along those lines. So I'll hand it over to Sandra now to kind of get into more detail.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So let's talk about effective implementation. So effective July 1, the spend down and reallocation policy will become fully implemented. Allocations will be distributed on a consistent annual basis, and expenditures will be monitored on both a time-bound expenditure plan and the standard targets. And we'll go over those targets momentarily. So all OHCS grants will be allocated annually. This is going to be based on either the federal or the state fiscal year. The federal year being October 1st through 9/30, and the state fiscal year being July 1st through June 30. In dealing with funds that are received by OHCS on a quarterly or monthly basis, such as our document recording fee or our public purpose charges, we will now forward allocate those funds to allow for a full year allocation up front. So example, your EHA DERF that was allocated to you quarterly, those are now going to be provided as an annual allocation at the start of each fiscal year. Our hope is that this is going to be less of an administrative burden and a more simple way of doing business, and it would allow for you to do a more streamlined process in monitoring the spend down of these grants. So let's get into the targets, the spending targets. So there's going to be, the monitoring is going to be on both the spend down and the generated spending targets that the CAAs will plan. The standard spend down rate, which you see in this table, and a time-bound expenditure plan created by the Community Action Agency as part of the biennial work plan is going to be approved by OHCS for each of the grants that you receive. 25% through the expenditure period of the first quarter, at least 10% of the funding must be spent. This first quarter is meant to recognize startup time needed, as Caleb discussed earlier. At 50% or second quarter through the expenditure period, at least 25% of the funding must be spent. And then at the end of the third quarter, or 75%, we get a little bit more aggressive, whereas 65% of the funding needs to be spent. And then at fourth quarter, or 90% through the expenditure period, at least 90% of the funding must be spent. So if spending is below both of these rates, OPUS, as Caleb mentioned, we're doing some modifications within OPUS. OPUS will generate an automatic email to both OHCS staff and the community action staff, which you get to determine who that notification goes to. And it will only be sent if both of those rates are not being met. At that point, it'll generate the email, which will notify both staff, and then we'll start moving towards problem solving. Any questions on rates?
This is based off the FSR, quarterly FSR, or?
This is based off of, we are providing a new report, and we'll kind of get into the burn down report as well. Our reporting is going to change just a little bit.
It's based off of dollars cash actually spent at OHCS. So it's for RFS that are sent in the sent status. So it's actually cash out the door that this is talking about.
So literally April 1, the RFFs you've submitted for 3 quarters, is that what you're saying then?
The RFS that have been processed.
So I think in Q4 you're going to run into a problem because people won't have completed payroll and things like that to have drawn, if you're expecting it to match.
So one of the things I will say here, it's in the notes, but it's on the slide, is we're looking at program allocations, not admin allocations. So if you're able to get your program dollars out the door for less admin, more power to you. And so part of the payroll allocations, I mean, that might impact program delivery and that piece of it. But it isn't looking at the admin piece of it. And I think the other piece here that I want to just double down on is, it's up to you on making your plan on how you spend your money, right? This is the standard, so this is just kind of generally what we'll be looking at. But you know, each grant will specifically say, this is how I plan to spend that money. Now, I want to be clear on a couple things. If you plan to, if you submit your spend plan that says, I'm going to spend $0 until 95% of the way through the expenditure period, at which point I will spend 100% of my dollars, I would doubt that your program coordinator will approve that. And to be less facetious about it, you know, I think one of the areas that this is going to impact, and we don't have precise guidelines around this, right? But EHA acquisition, right? If you're planning on acquiring a property at the end of the biennium, we know that sometimes those timelines slip, and so it could be really hard for Vicky or somebody in the homeless services section to say, okay, we're not going to spend you know, much money, but in the last, you know, 3 months of the biennium, we're going to acquire a shelter that's going to use 70% of our EHA allocation. You know, you'll be, I would assume that you'll probably be having some conversations about that.
Erica, I think had her hand up.
Okay, so help me understand, because when you were talking, Caleb, you were saying that there was also a way to account for like funds that have been committed. And now you're saying that it's only based on funds that have been spent, but a lot of times, for example, with rent assistance, we might be committing to somebody for like a 6-month period, and we have really good ways to track that. Is there going to be a way for us to report that, and so that it doesn't impact kind of what you're saying?
Yes. So I'm going to get into the system modifications that we're going to be doing in Opus, and that is one of the system
Okay, that's good.
modifications.
Thank you.
Yeah, but to be clear on that is committed, and you will be able to report that. But your work plans is against dollars actually out the door. So if even if you say, you know, you have more than your entire allocation committed, but if you're under the dollars out the door on your work plan, that's where it's going to be a concern. That be, you know, on rent assistance specifically, this group probably doesn't know this, maybe they do. EHA historically has been able to, we get the general fund allocation and it transfers to an other funds bank account. And what that does is it makes it so it's not use or lose money. We can roll that money forward to the future biennia. What's in the governor's budget keeps the dollars in the general fund bank account. So EHA is now use or lose. So it doesn't matter if you have $100,000 of EHA, but $500,000 committed to specific clients. If you end the biennium and that money isn't spent, it goes back to the general fund. And so we'll be able to capture that information, and that's going to be part of our reporting, and that's important to tell. And the spending is going to be against actual dollars out the door.
So can you explain it? Oh, oops, sorry.
You've been trying for a while. I'm sorry.
So I know that a lot of this is focused on the home area, but I have grants that are like in weatherization, and if it's gonna flag a 65% funding, and here I have contractors out, and let's say due to weather, due to different things, we're not able to put the RFF in till closer to the ending, so you get these notices popping up. Does that like put you on a naughty list or what? Because it's still being funded, it's still being spent. You just can't report an RFF until you get all the expenditures in.
Yeah. Well, the direct answer is yes on the naughty list, I guess. I did not include words naughty list in any part of this policy. But you know, I think that's part of why you create your work plan based on how you expect to. Because if you expect at 65% or 75%, you're not going to be at 65%. Put that in there, and you know, you'll work with OHCS program coordinator. But if that's what you're planning on doing, then you're not going to be on a naughty list because you're not below both of them, right?
She's
That's what
talking
you're
about
planning.
something she's not planning for.
But you could
Bad weather is not something everybody plans for.
and amend.
You can modify, yeah.
You can modify the work plan, and Sandra's going to be getting to this in a minute. But essentially, that, I mean, or I'll just let you get into it, because that's.
You can go ahead if you want.
No,
Any other questions about the spending targets? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted you to go back to EHA and the whole acquisition piece of it, where it's, say, you know, we're gonna be buying a building for a shelter. So we decide to buy it in March, but everything slows down and we don't actually buy it until July, say, for example. I mean, how, you kind of alluded to that and it kind of went sailing over my head.
Yeah, well, in that case, if you were planning to spend the money in March, but you don't actually, you can't actually spend the money till July, that is general fund that goes back to the general fund.
So it does.
So that is money that is.
So there's no wiggle room on the acquisition piece.
So
Okay.
there's no
That's
more
under
10% rollover?
Other than the 10%.
That's the second year.
Okay.
The second year of the biennium is where it will revert back to the general fund. The first year, it's my understanding you can roll over 10% until your second year allocation.
Got it.
So that 10% is only within the biennium? It's not?
No, it's 10% every year. This very first time, we're going to let you do, every grant is different, right? So SHAP, you can't roll over any because it is general fund. It is use or lose. If you don't incur that expense, if you know the good or service isn't purchased by June 30th
Of the end of the biennium.
of the end of the biennium, that money is gone. We have to send it back to the general fund. We don't have a choice. And some federal grants are like that as well, right? Is you got to spend the money. If you don't, you know, and that's one of the biggest things is we don't want, we want our precious dollars to be used. We don't want to lose them back to the Fed or to the state general funds to fund all of the important things that the legislature has to fund. And so, you know, there's some element of grant specific, but as of June 30 of this year, June 30, 19, if you've been able to roll it forward before, you'll be able to roll it forward now. And then going forward, for every year after that, you'll be able to roll forward up to 10%.
Okay.
To the extent that the grant allows it.
So even though EHA is moving to the general fund, they're still allowing us that 10%?
Absolutely. As of next biennium, EHA stays in the general fund. So yes, as of this transition period, we can still roll it forward. I know there's a ton of nuance in here, so.
Any other questions before we move forward? No? Okay. So let's talk about what happens when the spending targets aren't met. So the first step is OHCS will work with the Community Action Agency to assist in problem solving to unique situations because we understand that not all situations are the same for each Community Action Network. So program staff will work with the community action staff to discuss best practices, training, and or technical assistant needs that exist, and will help assist you in those areas. We also have integrators that can travel to the Community Action Agency to brainstorm and potentially facilitate connections with service providers or provide other community connections to utilize the funding that's on the table. The Community Action Agency will also need to modify and update their time-bound expenditure plan and provide that amended plan to OHCS within 30 days of that notification received. If the targets continue to be unmet within that next reporting period, OHCS will then notify the Community Action Agency Board Chair and the Executive Director, and then a request for a final updated time-bound expenditure plan will be required after 30 days of that notification. So we're trying to work with you in the very beginning to kind of give you these steps to modify these work plans to ensure that these dollars are staying within your community. But if we continue to see that these targets aren't being met, that third and final step is we will move towards rescission of funding. So we will require that a report to the Housing Stability Council will be generated, which will outline the circumstances pertaining to the rescission, and we will move those funds to another community action agency that actually can use them within that expenditure period. Because again, we don't want any general fund to revert back to the general fund, and we don't want the federal government to recapture any federal funds. So this is a lot. Any questions here? Yeah.
Yeah, at what point in the expenditure period would trigger this? Any point we choose, or?
It's within the target not being met, so it could be at any point.
At any point during the expenditure?
And we're looking
so-
at 25, 50, 75, and 90.
And then we would trigger that ourselves, or you would?
The Opus is gonna trigger it for you. So Opus is gonna, we'll talk about that more in the modifications, but Opus is gonna trigger the notification. And at that point, it's gonna trigger the communication between OHCS and
Okay.
CAA.
The idea is that neither us nor you will have to be like, where am I? You know, if you're below both, we'll automatically be notified and can, you know, take whatever action we need to.
Other questions? Okay, let's talk about modifications in the system. So in order for us to implement these policy changes, we need to modify Opus. So there's 3 main modifications that we're making in the system. The first modification is that all OHCS grants will now have the opportunity to report committed funds. So this is not going to be a requirement. However, it's an opportunity for you to tell your true story, as we talked about earlier. You're going to have the ability to track allocated resources, committed resources, and then actual expenditures that have been made. So let's talk about the definition of committed, because this definition seems to be used differently in both aspects of energy services and homeless services. So committed is an amount of funding reserved for a specific client or project that will be spent, but hasn't yet been requested from OHCS. So our current process is we've used the inconsistent language between the 2 homeless services and energy services around obligated versus committed. And the new process is we're going to have all grants contain the ability to outline funding commitments through a uniform process. And this information will be reported on all of our OHCS external reports.
I believe the process right now is for homeless services, at least some of the grants, there's a spreadsheet. That is where you report obligated client, you know, to rental assistance or whatever the case may be.
Just
Oh, just home TDA, okay. So now this will be, weatherization currently has it as committed and Opus, where you can type whatever you want, you know, whatever amount in there. And so it will be it will be the same process for all of our grants, and it will be available for all of our grants, not just some of them.
So, does that include salaries?
That's a good question. I mean, that's not a question that has been posed before. I assume you're talking about specifically for like program delivery expenses. That's a great question. I don't have an answer, but we'll get back to you.
Did we say another hand go up? Connor?
So I'm trying to think about how that works with weatherization, where you're on a completed jobs basis for billing. Would you add outlay before the job is completed? Would you report that as, I'm trying to think about how you, so I'd assume that would be allowed to be reported as committed, but I wouldn't know where to report the commit until the job's complete.
It's one of the hard things about committed, right? And quite frankly, that's one of the reasons why the spending targets are against cash out the door rather than committed funds. It's one of the struggles we've had in the committed, because specifically weatherization, you do the job. Once it's done, you say, okay, I thought that I was going to use this federal funds and this state funds, but in actuality, because of the work done, the federal funds can only be used for this and the state funds can only be used for this, and so it shifts. And so that's really hard when we're looking at, you know, how money is spent, and are we going to run into a situation where funds have to be reverted? You know, it's the same for you. So there's flexibility in committed, right? It is what you're estimating as you're doing your calculations to say, this is how I think my money is going to be used. If you can tie it to, I think, you know, if for this specific weatherization job, I'm going to use 100 grand and 10 grand in Echo and you know, 5 grand in LIHEAP, then that's what you would put.
It's really what you're planning on reserving for that project.
Okay.
That's what you'll put as your committed. Any other questions? Yeah.
Will the committed be considered for the targets, percentage targets is spent down?
No, that's only based on actual expenditures. Any other questions? Okay, so modification number 2, all OHCS grants will move to annual allocations. The definition of an allocation, amount of funding made available to a community action agency to be used for a specific purpose. This new process allows for streamlining and efficient tracking of time-bound expenditures. State general fund is often allocated on a biennial basis, while certain federal and state funds are allocated on an annual, quarterly, or monthly basis. So this just, no matter what type of funding, you're gonna get it on an annual basis.
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
If you're gonna go to an annual allocation for draft recording fees, how are you gonna know it's accurate?
Great question. So there's, again, more detail in your packets, and there's even a lot more detail that's not in your packets. But essentially, we're going to be bearing that risk. We don't know what document recording fee is going to be. We are making tomorrow's money that we don't know what is going to be available today. And so we're going to, it is relatively consistent. We've been, we know what we've been receiving for many years now. And so we're going to forward allocate. We're going to estimate what it is. We're going to make it available to you. Now there's nuance in there. We're going to create a one-time working capital reserve. So we're going to make, in the first year, we're going to make 90% of what we think will be available. And so that creates a buffer for us. And that way, if a year from now the money came in less than we thought, we would kind of tap into that buffer in order to keep the allocations more consistent. So we'll create a small reserve in order for us to be able to weather the storm if the funding doesn't actually come as high as we expected it to.
So if, just to use big round numbers, if you handed out $1 million, but what really came in that year once it was over was like $1.1 million, that extra one that didn't get allocated, are you going to put that into this next year?
Exactly.
Okay.
If it comes in less, we'll have that buffer.
Right.
If it comes in more, we'll just add it to the next annual allocation.
There's a hand in the back there.
Is the timeline by which the DRF funds need to be spent out going to remain, basically, it doesn't have deadlines?
All of our grants have the same annual time-bound expenditure plans. So
They're all gonna be based on these spending targets and timelines.
CSBG will still be allocated for a calendar year, I'm assuming.
that's the second kind of nuanced question on CSBG. So right now we have a question on CSBG timelines, home TDA, reserve, and committed, whether or not that includes salaries for program delivery. So I'll go over our follow-up at the end, but let me make sure I update our thinking and we'll get back to you on that.
So on the state funds, which are biennial, are you just going to divide the amount in half and allocate half in year one and half in year two?
Yes, so we will allocate and monitor based on that, but your work plans do not need to be based on an annual allocation. Yours can be on the biannual allocation.
Yeah. So yeah, just to add a little context to that, for the general fund, you're going to get $1 million for, sorry, I think at the OACS level, $1 million for the whole biennium. If you would prefer to say, this is how I plan to spend that $1 million over 2 years versus just the one, dividing it in two and doing one by one, you can totally do that. And we'll just look at, okay, what was your plan for the first year, and are you on track for that first year? Again, it will ultimately feed you. You put your time-bound expenditure plan, you submit that to your program analyst, and so they'll look at it and approve it. But for the biennial fund, where you get 2 years worth of funding, you can totally look at the whole horizon and make your plan based on that.
So I can spend 80% the first year and 20% the second year, if need be.
Okay, just a moment. People in the back can't hear, so let's start using the mic.
Okay. So am I hearing you in saying that, so you're going to get a biennial, and you can report that, but say I want to spend 80% of my grant in the first year and 20% in the second year, that's allowable?
That would be, if you want to submit that, that would go to your program coordinator. And I would imagine, just like the flip side, if you said 20 and 80, they would say, great, how are you going to help clients in that second year?
Okay, I'm just...
Yeah. But yeah, no, that's, I mean, that's part of the idea here is you outline how you're gonna know the whole bucket of money rather than just what you have right now. And so make your plans.
It's a normal process of how you will work your work plans. It's just now we have these time-bound expenditure plans as well. Was there a hand in the back?
I had my hand up, but it was more about, which would probably be crazy talk. Is the system going to alert if our spend rate is much higher than what our expectation is? So if we said we were going to spend X amount, but we actually spent double that, will that also prompt?
No.
Because you don't care about if we spend it out faster. I'm just curious.
Yeah.
But
You'll be able to see that.
Yeah.
You'll be able to run the same reports that we'll be able to run. And Stealing Sandra's Thunder, there will be a kind of a program level report with a lot more weedsy detail, and then kind of like a management director report, which is like a visual graph where you could see, your, standard line, your line, and where you actually are. And you could run that at any day, at any time. But the alerts, the automated email alerts, are only going to come if you're below that rate.
I love this. He just likes to torment me by telling me I have to present, and then he just takes over the whole presentation. Any other questions? Okay, so let's go into modification 3. We are going to enhance OPUS reporting to support the policy. So this is where all of this reporting is coming in. So our primary enhancement is we're going to create a shared spending burn down report, which will be available to both us, OHCS, and the Community Action Agency staff, so anybody can run it, to track the actual expenditures against the spending targets and the time-bound expenditure plans. So there's going to be one that's going to be very detailed for the program coordinator to review, and then there's going to be one that's more just high level for your managers and directors to review. So it's going to give you that opportunity to see if you're spending higher or if you're spending lower. Questions? So let's talk about timeline. Oh, is there a question? Oh, sorry.
Okay, just a minute.
In regards to the burn down report in OPUS, will that be a new sector in OPUS? Will there be directions so that we can do that as well?
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Does that report also show our committed funds?
It's not going to show the committed funds. No.
Okay.
It's only going to show actual expenditures. Is that correct? The burn down report.
So I was in a meeting that you were in yesterday with our developer about what specific details, and so we, just to be clear, we'll put it out, and you could tell us if you want more or less detail. But the tracking will be against actual expenditures, but we were going to input the field just as a data point of committed there. We are also going to put as a data point in the more detailed report the RFFs that have been submitted but not processed yet. So you can have that point of context there where you say, here's where I'm at, here's what I know is committed, here's what I know that we've submitted but OHCS hasn't paid yet. So you can have that on the more detailed report. Again, that kind of more roll-up management report will just be spending graphic
But
stuff.
Committed is actually going to be on the summary report, right?
It will be in both places.
So moving to timeline. So next month, we hope to have all of the system development completed, and then we're going to create some training resources. So May and June, those training resources will be deployed, and those are going to include webinars, and we're going to write some materials, and then we're actually going to provide a software demonstration video on our internet. And so we'll send out notifications when all of this has been completed and is being ready to be sent out. Between now and June, you'll work with the program staff at OHCS to complete your work plans for 1921. And those work plans will include the time-bound expenditure information for all OHCS grants. Also, between now and June, we're working on the completion of the MGA, and we hope to have it executed, so signed by the Community Action Agency and OHCS by June 30. That's our hope. And then in July, all aspects of the policy become effective. It does allow for a one-time roll forward of funds to be combined with current allocations in the time-bound expenditure plan. questions?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
So I thought I saw in an email that we wouldn't have to do.
Okay, just a moment, just a moment.
Oh, sorry.
People in the back.
I thought I saw in an email that we didn't have to necessarily do the time-bound expenditure information until we got our official amount allocated.
And that might be, yeah. So that, I guess that should say more April for July. Any other questions? Okay. So here is our contact information. You probably all know how to get a hold of us if you have any further questions or comments. We're happy to answer anything that you have that comes up later. We appreciate the time you've given us today.